Hello, this is Jeff Custer, and welcome to the Wednesday night Bible class for the Fort Walton Beach Church of Christ. We are studying 1 Peter, and we're glad that you're joining us. You can pick up today. Previous lessons are not necessary. We're going to be looking today in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 through chapter 2, verse 3. It would really be helpful to you if you were to read these verses now. Stop the video and read the verses, then come back and join us as we work our way through this passage. You've probably heard this kind of story repeated in your own experience. She was a tremendous example in the youth group of a Christian young lady. She did just about everything. She shared her faith. She was radiant. She was involved. She was kind. She was sociable. And really everyone was so proud of her. But things began to go wrong when her parents were going through marital difficulties, and they came to where they couldn't tolerate one another anymore, and they were divorced. So she began to go to church on her own and no longer had the support of her mother and father. At first, things seemed like they would go all right, but she was shaken. And her involvement began to be less. It worsened when one of her friends, who she had led to the Lord, had an illness and died. She began to question her faith. She began to stray. Pretty soon she was attending only on Sunday mornings, sort of as a routine. And sadly, in time, she no longer came at all. If you would go to her today and ask her, she would tell you that she is an agnostic or an atheist. What had happened? Life overcame her. Struggles and problems and stresses and persecutions and difficulties overcame her, and her faith didn't survive. In 1 Peter, Peter is talking to people who are facing difficulties that threaten their faith as well. This story is not about any real specific person, even though you could put a name, many different names perhaps, to the story. It's really about the struggle. It's about the situation, the difficulties that confront a person's faith. Maybe you've been that person at one time. Maybe a loved one, a family member, a friend has been that person at one time. The real question is, what do we do? How do we remain strong when our world is falling apart? Peter wants those that are listening to this letter in the first century to be ready for persecution that was going to come across for them. Things were about to get ugly. Nero is just beginning to ramp up his persecutions. Would their faith survive? Would they get through these difficult times? That's what Peter is concerned about. How can we remain faithful when our world is falling apart? And so he gives these encouragements in this teaching. He doesn't say much about prayer life or church attendance or Bible study. Not that those things aren't important and that they cannot help a person to remain faithful in difficult times. What he does do is he calls them to a life of holiness. And in fact, in my particular Bible, the ESV, in the margin above verse 13, it says specifically this: we are called to be holy. And I think what's important to see is that he calls them to be holy so that they can survive spiritually. In Peter, the call to be holy is more than just living a life the way God wants us to live it. It's also about a strategy to survive in spiritually difficult times. It's more than just not drinking or swearing or being immoral. It's not about a list of don'ts in our lives. It is about how to live so that we can stand in times that are difficult, times that maybe you're going through even now. So how do we develop the kind of holiness that helps us to keep standing when everything around us is falling down? Our study begins in verse 13 of 1 Peter, and he says this, "Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ." So may I reemphasize that first phrase, therefore, preparing your minds for action. The first thing we have to do is we need to prepare our minds. The idea is that you need to get ready and do what's necessary. Some versions have the expression, gird your minds. The Greek word here literally means to bind up the loins of your mind. And maybe the context, thinking about the way they dressed in that day, would be helpful. People wore long flowing robes, and when a person wanted to run or get ready for action or be active, often they would take those robes and hike them up and put a belt around them so that they could be ready to do whatever it is that they needed to do. When it says gird up your mind, it's that imagery that we have. You are getting ready for action. You are prepared for what's coming up. It's really sad, but sometimes people think that because you are Christian, bad things aren't going to happen. And people live in sort of this bubble, they think, of protection, and they think that nothing can harm them. But I think that life experience can show you that sometimes Christians are the ones that actually suffer more persecution. Peter knew this. Peter had seen it in his lifetime. And he wants these people that he's writing to be prepared because he knows that greater persecution is going to come. He wants them to be ready. And so he says, gird up your minds, or prepare your minds for what's happening. That preparation is to understand that these difficulties are going to come. And it encourages us to not assume that everything is just going to be smooth. So that when the thing that comes, we'll not be blown away. We'll not be saying, how could this happen to me? What did I do? Or what? No, this is what happens in life. Gird up your minds. Prepare your minds for action. Be ready for what's coming ahead. So the suffering Christian needs to remember this. It is not a question of if suffering will happen, but rather what we're going to do, how we're going to respond when that suffering comes. So first, we want to remember this, that we need to prepare our minds. But secondly, let me say this too, we also need to be self-controlled. We need to be sober-minded. My particular version, the English Standard Version, says this, and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So your version might say be sober-minded, or it might say be self-controlled. This is the idea. I would combine the two ideas, be sober and self-controlled. Being sober-minded and self-controlled is really saying, pull yourself together and don't be blown away by what happens. Be prepared for it. And when it comes, respond properly. Sober-minded people know that bad things are going to happen in life. And they prepare themselves for them. They don't worry so much about controlling every situation. In fact, I think being sober-minded and self-controlled demands that we understand that not everything is going to be under control, and that it's sometimes just a waste of time trying to control the situation. More important is how we are going to respond to that which we cannot control. It also means that we need to do as Peter encourages us and really give ourselves over completely to the grace of Jesus. To trust him, trust his grace. He's learned a long time ago. You remember the story when Jesus calls him to step out of the boat and Peter begins to walk on the water. He realized from that time forward, I think, that in difficult times, you can't take your eyes off of Jesus. Because when you take your eyes off the grace of God, off of Jesus, you'll begin to drown in the troubles and the difficulties of life that surround us, whether we're in the first century or in the 21st century. Thirdly, we are to live as pilgrims in this world. I like the title of this book by Karen Spears Zachariah. Her book is entitled, "Will Jesus Buy Me a Double Wide?" And then in parentheses, "Because I need more room for my plasma TV." It's an indictment against the health and wealth gospel that sometimes you hear people preaching or accepting. Jesus isn't here to make us comfortable in this world. Jesus didn't come to make us rich. Jesus came to prepare us for the life yet to come. And this life was to be lived and seen as something temporary, something not to be permanent, not to be seen as the end all of existence. So that's the idea of living as a pilgrim. A pilgrim is someone that's just a passing through, that is going to a new land, to a new place. And we are on our way to a new place. We're on our way to heaven. Peter writes in verses 17 and 18, "Conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your stay on earth, knowing that you were not redeemed with the perishable things like silver or gold, from your futile way of life inherited from your fathers." So conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your stay. You're only here temporarily. Don't pay so much attention. Be so concerned about the gold and silver of this short existence that we have. He says, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. That's an interesting way to look at our lives. This life is our exile. But one day we're going to be in our eternal home. And that's where our focus ought to be. That's where our emphasis ought to be. One of the emphases of holiness might be to live more simply, to refuse to allow the things that we own to control us. Personally, I'm kind of learning that lesson. Not that I didn't know parts of it earlier, but here at this particular stage of my life, I'm learning it in a more deep way. Here at the end of my life, I'm thinking about several things that require me to live more simply. One is, as I have changed jobs and am facing eventually retirement, is to learn to live on less income. And most people do that when they retire, so it's nothing new. But it means releasing the hold that things have on you and to de-emphasizing the things that don't really matter. So I'm really thankful for that. Secondly, we also are talking about, by we, I mean Suzanne and I, we're talking about going on a hike on the Appalachian Trail. It's going to be an extended hike. And so we're going to have everything that really, practically speaking, everything that we own will be on our backs. Now, we're not selling everything. We'll store some clothes and things like that. But we intend to actually rent our house out. And so we're decluttering our house. We are getting rid of things. We're giving away things. And we have made this challenge to ourselves. Okay, what is it that we really need in the future? And so we're preparing not for life as it has been, not for a life of more material abundance, but a life of simplified living with less things, a smaller apartment rather than a larger house. And I think that's very, very important as well. So Appalachian Trail and living with everything on your back and getting rid of goods and learning to live in retirement on less, these are helpful lessons for me. But I think that Peter wants us all to have this understanding that, hey, what we're going through right now, we can't let the things of this life become too important for us. We are really just preparing for a future down the road. And we need to separate the luxuries and separate the non-essential things from that which is essential. The essential things are the things of Jesus Christ and the things of faith. And the non-essential are the things that we give so much credence to, so much time and energy and finances to as we accumulate goods. But we can't let the gold and silver of our lives control us. And fourth, we are to live as people who love one another. I think it's just absolutely essential to have this emphasis. Let me just read from the ESV in verse 22 and 23. It says, having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart, since you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and abiding word of God. I love the wording here. Love one another earnestly. Another version says, love one another fervently, love one another. And so it's something that we need to also grow in. To get through the difficult times, we need one another. We need to be there for other people during their difficult times. And so Peter knows that the Christians in the first century are going to need one another, and he calls on them to be there and to love one another fervently. When Peter says fervently love one another, he is calling us to truly be devoted to one another. And maybe it's easy for us to say we're devoted to God, but we need to realize that being devoted to God requires that we also be devoted to one another. Peter knew that Nero's persecution was coming. He knew that the Christians that he's writing to are going to have greater stresses on their faith than ever before, greater challenges than ever before. And he wants them to be there for one another. Some people believe that we are going to face more persecution as Christians in our nation. I believe that as we become an increasingly secular society, you're going to have more and more people question your faith. You're going to have more and more people persecute you in different ways because you insist on believing in Jesus no matter what, that you are swimming against the current. And so we need these words of Peter as well. We need to love one another. We're going to need to stand side by side, linking our arms, being prepared to withstand what's about to come. And the fifth thing I'd like to say to you is that Peter, not me, is saying, grow up, you know? We all love babies. Babies are great. You know, babies feel so good when you put them on your chest. They smell like baby powder, at least if you're lucky. The babies coo and smile and searching for your eyes. All of that is just very captivating. It touches you deeply inside. But you know, nobody wants a baby to remain a baby. Not only will the baby grow physically, but as it grows physically, it needs to also grow mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Nothing is worse than an adult who acts like a baby. The difficulty with babies is babies are very self-centered. They believe that the world just revolves about them. They cry and they scream until they get their way. An adult that does that is nothing but a pain in the neck. And I hope that doesn't describe you and me too often. Well, grow up. You might want to emphasize chapter 2 and verse 1, where he says, like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word. What he's trying to say to us is that, and to the Christians of the first century, what he's saying is you need to develop. You need to grow. And this spiritual milk, this is your way to grow in the Lord. And so he's saying, long for it. Be nourished by it. The problem is sometimes Christians don't grow up. And you'll see in the lives of some fully grown adults, things that are really childlike. The demand to have their way. You know, they want things to be the way they say. And to them, Peter, to us who are like that, Peter would say, grow up. We all start like babies, but if we want to survive spiritually, we need to grow up. We all start like babies, but if we want to survive under pressure, then we're going to need to grow up. So how do we survive when everything around us is falling apart? Peter was a man who grew during his spiritual life. We have already talked about his growth from the impetuous and somewhat self-centered man in the beginning to be the great apostle that he is when he writes this letter. Peter wants all of us to grow as he grew, to be ready to withstand the difficulties of this world. Peter, in his growth, was able to stand because he also dedicated himself to holiness, the holiness that he's preaching